Today's lecture is going to cover the September-October Public Forum resolution. The United States federal government should substantially increase its military presence in the Arctic. In this lecture, I will cover the major terms, an overview of the issues, and the pro and the con arguments. The Arctic is a region located in the northernmost part of the Earth, and you can see it over there on the map in the left-hand side where you can see the Arctic Ocean and the North Pole. And it's generally defined to include the Arctic Circle, which is the circle with on the outer edges with the small breaks. And you can see there the countries with territory that it overlaps, such as Russia, the United States through Alaska, Canada, Norway, to name a few. There are some other definitions of the Arctic that focus on like total ice coverage, the location of the ice coverage, the presence of indigenous groups, but those are going to vary. So it makes sense to use this definition, which I don't think will be too controversial or really affect any of the arguments in the debate. Now, this has become such an important topic because there's a considerable amount of Arctic ice melting due to climate change, which is opening up transit for both industry and the military.
Climate change and rising global temperatures are causing the Arctic Ocean to melt, and several prominent countries are working toward taking more control over opportunities in the region. The United States is battling against Russia and China for territorial control as sea routes become more navigable.
Now, what does it mean to increase military presence? It generally means increasing bases and people, the support infrastructure that goes with it, the military vessels that are kind of in transit or maybe permanently stationed up in that area, as well as Coast Guard icebreakers, which we'll hear a lot about. Now, there's one important thing to note about U.S. military presence, and that is relative to Russia, the U.S. military presence is very insignificant, and it's probably even becoming insignificant compared to China's military presence in the Arctic.
From the U.S. standpoint, we're playing catch-up. Our forces from a naval standpoint are lacking. We've got 3 icebreakers compared to several dozen, if not 3 dozen at this point. On the Russian side, with China building its own fleet of icebreakers. So while we have a lot in place in terms of a 2019 strategic initiative by the Naval Chief of Staff, as well as a 2021 initiative by the White House itself, we're still in a catch-up mode.
Now, substantially increase. So increase just means to make greater. There's going to be more of it. The U.S. has some military presence there now. Substantially generally means a considerable percentage of material significance. So the pro's going to have to defend a meaningful increase in presence. The federal government and it. So this seems a little bit inconsequential, but it's actually important. The United States federal government is the central government in Washington, D.C., and it is possessive, meaning it's the military that belongs to the federal government of the United States. So the pro can't argue directly for increasing NATO's military presence. Now, they could say if the U.S. increased its military presence, other NATO countries would join in increasing their military presence. But the pro can't directly argue and say, hey, we're arguing NATO should directly increase its military presence. Now, let's look at the pro arguments, which will end up being the foundation of your contentions. And I've divided those into 3 categories: security, environmental, and economic. Security concerns focus on aggression from 2 potential countries. The primary one is Russia, which, if you remember back from the map, has a lot of territory in the Arctic and is really expanding its military presence. And obviously, based on its attack on the Ukraine, arguably presents a threat to peace. China is also increasing its military activity in Russia, even though China does not have territory in Russia. It says it's a near Arctic power, a country that has influence in the Arctic. So that's China's take on it. And they're using their economic power to support Russia's military power and its location in the Arctic as having territory to gain access to resources in the Arctic. So there's an individual threat from both countries, primarily Russia, but a lot of people are talking about the combined threat.
The Arctic has become an important arena of cooperation between Russia and China, with energy, trade, and other factors propelling cooperation. Analysts say that the melting of Arctic sea ice is offering economic and geostrategic opportunities for China-Russia cooperation. Climate change is making the Arctic more accessible for militaries. Russia has set up a new Arctic Command and has opened hundreds of new and former Soviet-era Arctic military sites. These sites include airfields and deep-water ports. China has declared itself a near-Arctic state and plans to build the world's largest icebreaker. Beijing is spending tens of billions of dollars on energy, infrastructure, and research projects in the north.
The second potential threat is terrorism, especially as the Arctic develops and you have more civilian and military deployments in the Arctic. Terrorists could attack. A third thing, which is a little more of a debate argument, there are undersea cables that connect the internet. They don't quite look like the picture was what was generated on Midjourney, but the basic idea is that there's underwater sea cables that connect the internet across the globe, and those could be cut either by terrorists or other foreign powers, and this argument's come out on the topic. You also have related regions. Well, what does I mean? It's like, well, from the United States could project power into Europe to reinforce in the event of a wider Russian invasion of Europe, or into Asia in the event of a China attack to, reabsorb Taiwan. So these maps kind of show the location of the United States, and, even here on the left, right, that's Alaska. So you could potentially kind of reinforce over to Asia on the right. Okay, you're probably talking about reinforcing to Europe, but even though our maps really think of the left and the right, going over the North Pole can be a direct route. Now, all these combined can promote U.S. hegemony and global leadership, our military power, our influence in the world as a unipolar power. This is really something that should be the subject of another lecture, so I won't get into it here, but it's a common debate argument. It's likely to come up on this topic. A second major set of arguments are environmental arguments. So some people say if we have more military support up there and, we have the Coast Guard and there's more activities, we might enforce environmental laws. I mean, it's not something that really the military does, but as kind of part of its presence and associated presence, there might be greater enforcement of environmental laws to stop things such as overfishing. There'd also be greater potential responses to oil spills, and oil spills can be very dangerous for the environment.
I would put to you, well, there are strategic goals which exist by taking control of the Northern Sea routes, for example, the control over trade, as well as access to fossil fuels.
Now, in terms of the economic benefits to increasing U.S. military presence in the Arctic, one is protecting trade routes so that our industry can export and export efficiently. As you can see, there are two different sea routes developing, the Northwest Passage and the Northern Sea Route. The second is strengthening U.S. economic competitiveness. Now, when the U.S. industry sells goods abroad, it obviously costs them so much money to sell the goods abroad. But if they can ship cheaper because the routes are shorter, then their goods will become either more competitive or at least stay competitive with other countries that are using those sea routes. The third reason that there are economic benefits to increasing U.S. military presence in the Arctic is that it can stabilize the area and protect U.S. industries when they're trying to access resources such as oil and rare earth minerals. Rare earth minerals are those minerals that are essential to modern electronics.
Growing cooperation in the Arctic between Russia and China may be outpacing the U.S.'s advances. These are the main Arctic shipping routes: the Northern Sea Route, which runs along the Russian Arctic coast, and the Northwest Passage, which runs along North America's northern coast. The United States has been deploying icebreakers to the region and tracking foreign vessels, which are all competing to clear navigation through icy waters and create new shipping paths.
So those are some of the major categories of pro arguments. Let's look at the con. The con, there's this general category of arguments that says it'll take a lot of money and consume a lot of resources. I left in here the generic picture that PowerPoint inserts just because I thought it was a little humorous. This is not something that would literally be paid for on a actual credit card, but it is something, as we'll talk about, that may be paid for on the government's credit card by borrowing more money, and it would certainly take a lot of resources from the military that would have to be kind of created or taken from somewhere else. So why is this kind of so expensive and consume so many resources? I really wouldn't normally go into such detail on such a introductory lecture. But I think a core con argument is going to be, there'll be some of it'll be cost. I don't know if there'll be a major argument. There could be a lot of military resource trade-offs for other areas. So I want you to kind of think about why it would be so resource intensive to increase military presence in an area we don't really have a lot of military presence. We have, a couple bases in Alaska. There's some, a little bit of military activity up in the Arctic. But to really substantially increase it, we'd need a lot of infrastructure development, right, to support the troops. We'd have to take specialized military equipment up to the Arctic and have it work in those cold temperatures over a sustained period of time. We'd have to have operations going on and maintenance to support all this infrastructure and military operations. We would also have, many logistical challenges that would arise that would have to be dealt with by, civilian parts of the military that are up there supporting that, just like we have civilians part of bases in the United States. We'd have to do a lot of training, and we'd have to support a lot of personnel who are actually up there in the Arctic. And of course, they'd have to be outfitted with a substantial amount of warm weather gear. There are also environmental considerations that would have to be dealt with. The military would probably try to want to minimize the environmental impact of that. And, that can be a con argument in and of itself, right? Just kind of all the disruptions to the environment that could occur as a result of the military activity. We'd also have to kind of communicate. There'd have to be a lot of communications technology that was put up into the Arctic. The technology itself, plus operating it, would be very expensive. And we would also have to deploy a number of strategic assets. And as I said, all this equipment, right, just beyond the weapon systems, there's also a number of strategic assets such as aircraft that can move a lot of people and helicopters and transport ships that would have to be deployed up into the Arctic areas. You would also have to kind of consult and coordinate with indigenous groups that are up there now. So this would take a lot of resources, right? Financial resources, military resources. Where would these resources come from? Well, some of it could come from our existing military infrastructure. Now, some of that infrastructure, we'd have to maybe take some troops from East Asia and deploy them up to the Arctic, or take some troops from Europe and deploy them up to the Arctic. That would not only cost money, but of course take resources from those areas that may be important to deterring China and Russia, and there are arguments related to that. It also could trade off, right? The cost alone of this could trade off with maybe particular military weapon systems that are being developed, or just, the costs of supporting those forces in Europe. We might have to cut some social programs as a result of this. So there's different, there's military resource trade-off arguments. Then there's social program trade-off arguments. And then we could also, manage this in other ways, right? We could also raise taxes. There's really not a lot of support for that. That's probably difficult to imagine. But we might have to increase the amount of money that we're borrowing, increasing our annual deficit and our total debt. So that's really why I wanted to walk you through the details of how resource intensive, really meaningfully increasing military presence in the Arctic would require, so you can support your debating on some of these trade-off arguments. Now, the United States military currently has a lot of difficulty recruiting. And if you want some evidence for that, of course, you can find it on the internet. But if you look in the September-October release on mandatory national service, one of the arguments there is that the military is failing to recruit. And that's, an argument there in favor of mandatory national service. But the argument that you can make here is that if we don't have enough people in the military to support the presence, or if we do take our military presence, the pro has to argue for the United States increasing its military presence in the Arctic, which the definitions say are its troops. Those are not private military contractors. But if we started using troops from other areas, such as Europe, all right, or East Asia, or, in South America, in Africa, we might have to replace those with private military contractors. And there's a lot of evidence that says private military contractors are more likely to engage in human rights abuses. They're less controllable. They have the potential to not follow orders. So there's a lot of disadvantages associated with private military contractors. And if the United States increased its military presence in the Arctic, it might have to depend on those contractors in other areas. Now, a next set of arguments deals with why it would actually be bad to encircle or isolate Russia and China, right? Remember the pros potential advantage for increasing military presence, which they'll outline in their contention, as this would kind of push China and Russia back in the Arctic. If Putin lost out in the Arctic, so to speak, from the United States, this could A, hurt him politically, and B, isolate him militarily.
15 some odd years ago, Putin really basically wanted to revise what Joseph Stalin's dream of what they called the Red Arctic was. And he had that same sense. But as your guest also said, it's really important to understand Russia is a mafia state. I've described it that way in articles I've written. When I've been interviewed before with newspapers, we've called it, Putin's mafia state, Murder Inc., etc. And he thinks in terms of natural resources. So on the flip side of that, though, I would say one thing that from a military standpoint to be prepared, because war doesn't have any kind of certainty. You have to be prepared for all options. Is that from that standpoint, we should take Putin at his word. I think you could argue his foray into Ukraine, he tried to cover with the same kind of myth. So call it the Red Arctic myth for wanting to go after the Northern Sea Route and claim its natural resources for Russia. And Ukraine, he used the Kiev and Rus myth that somehow Russia was started in Crimea simply because St. Volodymyr or St. Vladimir, if you're Russian, was baptized there. He uses those myths to basically go about implementing his mafia state, which is all about seizing natural resources to divide up amongst his various oligarchs. So, I do think we ought to take him somewhat serious, that when he's talking these myths, he's got an ulterior motive in mind. Some of it right now is desperation, as your guest said, to distract the West from what's really going on, the weakness in Ukraine. But some of it is foreshadowing of what he wants to do. So if he survives, if he somehow survives this catastrophe that's going on in Ukraine, I don't think we can completely discount that he will be able to step back and refocus his efforts. And he has invested a lot of money before he made the mistake of going into Ukraine and trying to pull that off on the Northern Sea Route.
As you can see, right, from the map, if you look back at the map, there's a lot of Russian territory in the Arctic. So part of Russia's reason to have military presence there is both to defend itself and, in the event that it was attacked, have a way to retaliate against the United States. And this is explained more in the essay, so I won't go on to it here. But the basic idea is that if Russia's attacked, it has nuclear submarines up in the Arctic that could launch nuclear weapons at the United States. And this is a way that Russia has of deterring a U.S. attack on Russia. So that's a strategic loss for Putin. It would be a political loss. For Xi, the Arctic is probably not as important to its security, right? It's not an Arctic power. It doesn't have land in the Arctic. But it would be a political loss for Xi. And there's going to be evidence that says if Xi takes a political loss, he's going to be more likely to lash out and do things like attack Taiwan. A second area of harms can come from the effect on indigenous peoples. A lot of military activity there is going to threaten how the indigenous people live, where they live, what resource access they have, all because foreign militaries come up kind of into the Arctic and start invading their space. There have also been traditional problems with basing. Women are also often the victims of physical aggression and sometimes sexual assault on military bases, and that's even in countries where the bases are based in cities. Right now we have a bunch of people living in very isolated areas, so there's probably evidence that says that this problem would be likely even worse in the Arctic. And it is an argument that has been common on previous policy and public forum debate topics. So I expect this argument to be popular here in September and October. There's also the arguments about hegemony being bad, right? That U.S. power projection across the world is bad, that it inhibits a transition to a multipolar world, a world where power is more evenly distributed, and that large U.S. military power and leadership can facilitate wars of aggression, triggering terrorism, causing other countries to build up their more military power, and, as we saw in the trade-off arguments, wasting domestic resources. There are also arguments about why it's bad to militarize and securitize problems. that this, it's just kind of a subset of a little bit of the hegemony bad arguments, a little bit of the arguments about how it's going to destroy indigenous culture. You have some of the arguments up there, a big military footprint. I didn't re-include it on the con because I'd already talked about it on the pro as well. But a big military footprint is going to hurt the environment, right? It's going to consume a lot of energy. The transportation of the systems is going to disrupt the environmental infrastructure and their architecture that exists there. Now, there's also arguments about imperialism, which are related, again, also to the hegemony bad argument, just a different way of articulating it. The United States, Western powers, and really even, other powers, right? China's been an imperial power. The United Kingdom was an imperial power. The U.S. is an imperial power. Imperialism basically refers to the idea of going to a place, disrupting the local environment, taking the resources, subjugating the people. In this case, there'd be the indigenous people who are already living there. Finally, there are arguments about U.S. politics. Increasing U.S. military presence could have political implications that actually might help Biden politically because there's a lot of political support for more militarization of the Arctic, and the United States is asserting its interests there. There are also common, problems that could be created if this starts creating defense trade-offs in other areas, if it causes the debt to increase, if it causes cuts in social programs, that could hurt Biden politically. But I just wanted to bring those arguments up. They're not that popular in public forum debate. They're becoming a little more popular on the national circuit. They originally started out in policy debate, and they're a big part of Lincoln-Douglas debate. So this is just a quick lecture, and as you unpack, there's a little more detail in the essay. There's obviously more detail, and there's research in our evidence file. We have a comprehensive set of definitions on the website. There's a lot of additional material on the website that you can use to unpack your understanding of this topic, but this lecture hits the major highlights.